Welcome to K-Pastors Roundtable. I'm your host, Alex. This is a warning. Today's topic is sexual addiction. The language used is explicit and inappropriate for children. Please use your discretion to listen. If you are offended with the explicit language, please do not listen today. Thank you. Today, I'm with Pastor Roy Kim and Andy Park. They're both family licensed therapists. And so they're here today to talk about a topic in some ways kind of taboo in Korean society, and that is sex addiction. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be here.
Okay, so who would like to introduce a little bit of the background of what addiction is?
Well, sex addiction is, the more that you study it, the more that it has similarities with a lot of other types of addictions,
Yes.
whether it is what they call a process addiction, such as gambling or eating, maybe spending, or like a substance addiction, such as narcotics, nicotine, things like that. But I think maybe one of the reasons why it's so taboo, and maybe one of the reasons why it is so devastating, is because the person that you are betraying with the sex addiction, usually I think they take it much more personally than another type of addiction would. And that's understandably so, because when you are having sex, whether it's with, the screen or with another person, the person that you are betraying is thinking, well, what's wrong with me? And really ruptures a relationship in that way. So I think the effect of the sex addiction can be sometimes more devastating than other addictions, but actually what's happening in the addiction process is very, very similar to other addictions.
And what kind of signs one would expect to see in somebody that's addicted to sex?
I wish there was just one whole category saying, oh, if you just do this amount of times, that means you're addicted.
Right.
But there's a very varying degree of how we can assess if someone is addicted to sex. And a lot of times it's mainly found in these secretive behaviors. And so a lot of secrecy when it comes to their behaviors or people not following through with some of their commitments. And so what we find in many addictions is that people's life and their priorities are thrown out the window because the addiction takes over. And so whether they are staying home more because they're looking at pornography, or they are going out late at night to unknown places, or there's mysterious charges on their credit cards. There's a lot of different signs and symptoms of it. There's not just one type of person that gets addicted to sex. And unfortunately, today's day in society is very hypersexual. And so a lot of people are more exposed to sex early on, especially from school, from the internet. So it's just how our relationship with that. And people who are addicted to sex, their highest priority and their highest need, if you really, really ask them, is sex and getting pleasure from intimacy in that way, whether it's through massage parlors or with prostitutes or anonymous people. If you really ask them and really dig down deep, every day they're thinking about sex, they're talking about sex, they are obsessed with sex in some way. There is a obsession with it, and also compulsion is what we see as both of them acting out. You obsess about it, whether it's in your mind, and then you have to act out in order to kind of get that release and that euphoric pleasure that you get. And so even if you just put a room of 100 people in there in one room, it's hard to see who is a sex addict. Mm-hmm. There's no real symptoms that you see because it's a very secretive addiction. And only time it kind of comes out is when people find out, or they're exposed, or they get caught doing something. And so there's no one type person, but we're hoping that as we talk about this, people are rethinking some of their behaviors and seeing this may be destructive and it can ruin my life, my family, my marriage.
Mm-hmm. What you mentioned and Pastor Roy mentioned, between addicted to the screen, pornography on the computers and things like that, and actually doing it with a person that's more addicted to, let's say, screen, would they justify saying, I'm not really doing this with anybody, so I'm not a sex addict?
Of course. Yes, that's going to be a very common rationalization for their behaviors. I also treat people that they have betrayed, like their spouse or their girlfriend, and sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes it's the female that has the sex addiction or the porn addiction, and it's the male who is traumatized. But whatever the case, there is a deep sense of betrayal because they're seeing that this person would rather have sexual pleasure with this other thing or this other person and not with me. And that's the common complaint and the common trauma that they experience.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of this, it's not just the act itself, but then it's the being in those moments where when you find out someone's, watching pornography and it's well, it's not a real person. However, when you step back and think about it, it's well, now that because I'm having this pleasure with a screen, now I'm not intimate in the bedroom anymore. And I'm instead wanting to be more intimate with someone fake and unknown. And that really feels like, well,
What's wrong with me?
What's wrong with me? Exactly. And that it becomes very traumatizing in many ways.
Also, I've read somewhere they justify saying you will make my relationship in the bedroom with their spouse more exciting. And that's how they justify it. How would you deal with that when somebody says that to you?
I think most of the research will show that that's false. I think most of the research shows that when a person has sexual pleasure from something that is unreal, the brain will react to that in such a way that it's kind of like the difference between eating a strawberry candy, which is all manufactured,
Right.
the taste is manufactured, and eating a regular strawberry that can have a bit of tartness to it.
Right.
So especially if you ask a little kid, what are they going to choose between a strawberry candy and a regular tart strawberry? I think they're usually going to go for the strawberry candy. The level of sweetness is so manufactured that their brain remembers how pleasurable it was to eat that strawberry candy.
Right.
So in like fashion, when someone is experiencing not just a screen, but that now their fantasy is getting involved, they are now the hero, the sexual hero of that fantasy. They are in control of everything that happens in their own mind. So they can press pause, they can rewind, they can even control what that sexual pleasure feels like. So everything is at like the optimum level of sexual height, similar to a strawberry candy. And when they try to then compare that with maybe sex with their wife, there's no way that that wife is going to compare to all the different ways that someone can control their sexual pleasure with this screen or with, paying for this, prostitute or whatever it is. And so the brain is going to get used to unrealistic sexual high. And so when they say things like this is going to enhance, our sexual relationship, it usually doesn't happen that way. It's actually the opposite. It often happens is what they call sexual anorexia or anhedonia, which is basically a decreased pleasure in sexual activity. Not the anorexia, the anhedonia, because your brain is thinking, well, this is okay, but I really want to go back to that first thing that was the strawberry candy.
Right. Yeah. Sounds like then something's happening in your brain chemically. So somebody that is addicted to something, aside from not only the sex, but other things, would they tend to be addicted to gambling or other things if you're addicted to sex?
Depends on the person. So some people are much more apt to wind. So I work with a lot of substance abuse individuals too, and we find there's a big pairing of people using methamphetamine and then also being sex addict too, because that's greatest euphoric pleasure when you add those things together. So when those things happen, people find the right recipe of what makes sense for them. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that, the perfect cake that I can enjoy. And that gets really complicated because when, like Roy has mentioned, when you don't get the same kind of pleasure, then people end up having to either change the stuff that they want or increase the amount of intensity in order to get the same kind of payout. And that's when it gets costly because people then start changing some of their behaviors like, oh, now I'm going to go, I was watching pornography, and maybe they end up starting to go into strip club because they really want that experience, the intense fantasy kind of experience. They'll find whatever works for them. So it really depends on the person, but that tends to be what ends up happening.
Okay. Since we're Christians, so what does Bible say, or is there biblical answers and solutions that suggested in the Bible for somebody that's addicted?
Great question. I think the only way, so far, what I've really experienced is, because I think most of my clients are Christian, what I've noticed is, especially in the groups that I run men's sex addiction group, and I also run pastors' sex addiction group. And without fail, the common experience in these groups is when these men are so used to secrecy and they're so used to not living authentic lives with other people, when they start to get used to sharing their shameful story in the company of other safe men in the group, they experience a liberation that, in my mind, in my experience, is the closest that I've experienced to real kingdom living. It's more powerful than maybe the best small group experience at church that I've experienced. The reason being is usually in any given small group, you're going to have a blend of people who, some people share a lot about their lives, even like the dark stuff, and other people will share just the surface stuff.
Right.
So you're going to get it's more like it's polite, it's fun, it's nice, it's a good time, and they will pray for you. But in these groups, each member in the group is there for a reason. They're there to either salvage their life or salvage their marriage and kind of get back on track again. And they have a buy-in that if I don't get authentic with these brothers here, I'm not going to get recovery. And so as they are authentically sharing even their most shameful memories, they're even sharing like, yes, this week I slipped back into porn. And we give them so much credit for actually presenting your authentic self. Now, it doesn't mean that we applaud them for slipping. We're now re-strategizing how to get back on track. But when they experience, they're presenting their authentic self to one another, and what they receive in return is brothers who see them for everything that they are and who shower love upon them and who say, I haven't given up on you, and we're going to re-strategize and we're going to get you back on track. That is, in essence, a Christ-like response that they are receiving week in, week out. So I think about things like John chapter 8, where the Pharisees were about to stone the adulterous woman. And as Jesus tells them, hey, those of you who are without sin, go ahead and cast it. Cast the first one. And they all drop it and they leave. And he says to her, is there anyone here left to condemn you? And she says, no one, Lord. And he says to her, well, neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. Well, with that in mind, when I look at these groups that I facilitate, it's the same culture, which is, I, Roy, do not condemn you for your decades worth of sex addiction. In fact, I get you because I have my own sex addiction history too. I get you completely. Let's now go and sin no more. Let me show you what the research says that actually helps people go and sin no more. So it's a combination of the grace that Christ himself gives to us in this group and the tools that research and science has given to us, thankfully, that shows what actually works out there. Because these guys have tried praying, it hasn't worked. Maybe for like 1% it works in the population, that's fantastic. But for the other 99, it doesn't work. And they're questioning their faith. Like, is my faith not strong enough? But we've been talking about this brain dynamic. Something does happen in the brain. God created a very mysterious brain that works in certain ways. And the brain chemicals work in certain ways. And the different parts of the brain work in different ways. And so we're trying to bring all this together with the love and the mercy of Christ, the lordship of Christ, as well as the actual powerful research that's out there that can actually help them get sober.
I saw the episode of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the first thing they say is, I'm an alcoholic. Do you do the same thing in the sex addiction groups, or?
We don't say it like that.
Okay.
But we do get to a place where we confront all the things that we have been in denial about. It's more of a conversation rather than, hello, I am Roy and I'm an alcoholic. It's more of a conversation through our story, also through some exercises that we do to really see what areas of our sex addiction have we been in denial about, and can we get to a place where we are no longer in denial about it, and that our willpower cannot get us sober, that I need the Lord, I need you guys, I need constant structure in my life so that I can finally be able to live porn and sex addiction free.
I love what Roy says and how that process is for people, because people try so hard to overcome this. They do everything in the book to try and stop watching porn or acting out sexually. But unfortunately, sheer will, it doesn't work in this addiction. It bypasses it. In our brains, what we say, they go offline, and we don't make conscious good decisions when we are going to watch porn or going to go act out. And so what we find is that, there's a lot of underlying things that keep people locked in to this specific way, this highway of getting pleasure, because that's their way of compensating for the things that are happening in their life. People are acting out so they feel better about themselves. And so Roy mentioned having these authentic, deep relationships that don't have to put on masks. These are one part of the story of how, like, when people can show up, then they can actually talk about things that are really keeping them trapped. And we find a lot of times that's the trauma they've experienced, whether it's growing up or whether it's in their current life today, and addressing those things and going through the different steps in the AA program or SAA program, and really working with their therapist, figuring out what's going on here. It's not just about you every single day making decisions to stay sober, but internally, how do we bring peace internally? How does God speak into that? How does he transform that? How do we address the painful memories from our past that are keeping this thing going? People are engaging these behaviors because they don't want any other way to deal with the pain. And so working through the pain of that and addressing these core issues that are really keeping people locked up has been the tremendous success of what we work with people, is putting all these things together will help give the greatest success in staying in recovery.
I'm talking with Pastor Roy Kim and the Park. They are both family therapists, both in the sex addiction and the traumatic experiences. One step back from the topic is that if somebody thinks they are addicted, to the sex, what would be the steps do you recommend somebody to seek out?
Well, if they have that suspicion, they can, I guess, get a bit more clarity. There's a very simple assessment called the Sexual Addiction Screening Test. If you just Google that, but it's a very simple, brief assessment where you just answer a few questions, and it gives you an idea of whether you do have sexual addictive patterns in your life. And if that's the case, I actually do recommend that they seek out a therapist who has training with sex addiction. The reason being is there are certain questions that I think, and certain questions and certain tasks and ways to evaluate, for us to be able to evaluate and actually help them get the proper steps to recovery. I think maybe a generalist therapist might eventually get there, but it might take much longer just because they're trying to understand the terms and all that kind of thing. So I think it would be good for them to seek out sex addiction therapists to really help them get through. And if they do the work, there's a high chance that they will get recovery. But that's the thing. Are they willing to do that work? It's a lot of work. It's a time investment. It's a money investment. I once spoke to some doctoral candidates in the DMIN program, and I asked them, you guys in leadership and ministry, if you were to go to your elder board and to say, hypothetically, if you had a history of either porn addiction or sexual addiction, and you shared with them that this was your issue, and how do you think they would respond? And they said, career suicide. Right? Career suicide. And we chuckled, and then my heart at the same time was sinking, because I'm thinking, well, sex addiction research shows strikes around 65%, 70% of males in the church, and maybe around 25% of females in the church, and around 55% of pastors in the church. And so when I look at them, I'm actually assuming that most of them have some struggle with sex addiction. And I don't judge them for it. I'm just thinking, you are a human being, and I'm sure that your template kind of sets you up to find sexual pleasures as your dopamine spike. But if you don't actually get treatment for it, then you're just living in secrecy like I did. And how does that actually help the ministry? How does that help actual authenticity? How do you actually show to the people that Christ's grace is real? Because if you don't show to the people that Christ came for sinners, not just like surface sinners, I'm talking like the worst of sinners, like Paul, who killed Christians. If he didn't come for them, then we're just making nice at the church. We're just kind of doing activities for the sake of doing activities. But real ministry comes when we're able to access the depth of our sin and say, I am powerless. I need the Lord and I need my brethren. And I wish so much that these candidates and maybe the church at large would have a different understanding of not just how to overcome addiction, but potential power of addiction being addressed in the way that Christ intended, which is, I came for you people. I came for you. My grace is for you. Let's be authentic. Let's confess our sins to one another, and let's roll up our sleeves and go and sin no more.
Andy, what percentage of the people that say that they have a problem with the sex addiction can actually recover? And also, what kind of time frame are we looking at?
Well, probably Roy may have the actual numbers. I don't have a lot of numbers in my brain. But one thing with any kind of addiction is that there's always a potential for relapse. And that's the biggest component, is that because we have a setback or we have a relapse doesn't mean that we failed. And unfortunately, we've been taught as Korean Americans to, if you fail, you fail. And you squat it there. And so that's a very toxic message. But
why B+? Why not A+?
A plus, actually, 100%. But for what we teach people is that setbacks are only helps us understand what's going on for you and helps us to reevaluate where you are in what we call the circles of are you engaging in healthy behaviors throughout your life? Are you doing anything that's slightly like a yellow light, like you should be very cautious of certain behaviors? Or are you doing things that are actually dangerous and are considered relapse behaviors for you? And so we tell people that life there'll be relapses. We're not saying you will relapse, but when you do, we want you to pick yourself back up and to re-engage and to not give up, because the more and more that we press on, the more and more that you really engage with the pain of what's going on for you, the higher the likelihood you you are to stay in recovery and also stay within a community that really is able to talk about these things. So we recommend people go to Sex Addicts Anonymous meetings or Celebrate Recovery meetings, because in those places, people understand addiction and they understand that it's not a one-time fail and that's it, but it's let's get back up, let's restart our days, let's restart sometimes our steps or whatever we need to do to get back on track, because if not, I'm going back into your behaviors and be back in the dark places that you once were.
Pastor Roy, is there an answer to like percentages or time frame?
I'll answer the time frame one first. It's more fresh in my mind. When I went through my modular training, some of the stats that I heard was that, let's say an adolescent who started viewing porn on the internet at age 14 or 13 or so, and they're now 17, 18, someone who with like a pornography addiction may be able to get sober within 6 months.
Oh, wow.
Maybe.
Okay.
Especially if they're doing their work.
Okay.
However, there's more complex addictions out there, maybe stemming from when they were younger, when maybe they were molested, maybe they were doing early sexual activities when they were younger, viewing pornography, or maybe viewing devious acts by mom or dad or some other part of family. And so when it's more complex and longer standing, and now they're, as an adult, they're engaging in the massage parlors and the prostitution and doing voyeuring, things like that, they usually give a time frame around 2 to 5 years. But again, it's not just 2 to 5 years of passive, just kind of letting time pass. It's doing the real work, the hard work of recovery. 2 to 5 years could be that window where you can expect to see some mastery over this addiction as opposed to it mastering you.
Right.
But as far as like the percentage of like people who do find recovery, I'm less clear about that, how to answer. But in my own experience, when working with people, there's a clear difference between those people who actually follow through with steps that we recommend, those people who don't follow through with those suggestions, they relapse repeatedly. Whereas the people who actually get rid of their smartphone, or they get rid of this and they make changes in their life so that it's harder and harder to access the very things that cause you trouble, they're the ones who tend to find steady gains month after month. They are reaching 90 days sobriety, 200 days of sobriety, 1.5 years of sobriety, much, I guess, quote unquote, easier than the people who don't actually follow through with what's recommended to them.
And that makes sense in how our brain is formed, is that we've gone through a certain highway of kind of going down certain neural pathways for so many years of this is exactly what I do, and these behaviors will get me this kind of pleasure. And so by distancing ourselves from these specific triggers that we have, we are setting new neural pathways and new pathways towards what this technology means to us. And so after so many years, you realize, oh, it still can be a triggering thing that I have, maybe my phone. However, if I can use it responsibly and stay within the green zones of using it wisely, then I can maintain sobriety. But in the beginning, there's this obsession with it and then compulsion to try and use it in certain ways to get what we want. And that's the hardest time, because when those neural pathways are so strong, people are very apt to relapsing because there's no other alternative.
Now, should someone think that they have a problem, should they approach their pastors?
Well, I think it really depends on the pastor that you're approaching, because there are some pastors, they don't like that feeling of not having answers, and so they'll fake it. They'll basically say, okay, they'll just kind of give some advice off the top of their head, maybe provide some scripture, they'll pray, they'll lay their hands and they'll pray for them. And it sounds very brotherly, it's very spiritual, but I don't know ultimately how helpful it will be for their sobriety journey for the pastor to respond in just that way. Now, if another pastor is the type who knows how to collaborate with other professionals in the community, whether not just sex addiction, it could be alcohol addiction, whatever, and they have a list of go-to people to contact and say, hey, this is something that I really want to partner with you about, because I care for this brother, and yet I don't know whether I have the actual tools to help him. So while we are deep in prayer for him, could we also ask you to come alongside and help him on a weekly basis,
right,
with his recovery? So a lot of it, the answer to the question is, if you go to your pastor, do you know what you're going to get in return? But just one more thing to say, and one of the things that really happens a lot that kind of tragic is that when a person tells a pastor, Pastor, I have been unfaithful to my wife, I have gone, not just a fair partner, but, I have had a history of strip clubs and whatever, sometimes the pastor will say, brother, immediately go to your wife and tell her what you've done. happening. Now, the reason why I feel that that is not the right way is because the spouse, number one, might not get the whole story. And so if that spouse is going to get the story in chunks,
Right.
you know, one time this week and then some more details next week and whatever, she's going to keep on getting traumatized by that. And number two, that spouse is going to need support.
Right.
You know, and it's not just the addict who needs help, but it's the spouse that needs help too. So the pastor can't just say, go and tell her right away. There needs to be some structure in place so that whatever information is given to her or sometimes to him, it needs to be done in the most ethical way possible.
Okay.
I hope that there are pastors who are listening to this who really understand that, who can visualize that happening and try to come up with a different strategy on how to react to a crisis situation like that.
Okay.
And a sex addiction therapist can really help the pastor strategize on how to make that disclosure happen to the spouse.
Okay.
Yeah, I love how Roy just mentioned that because I have clients who come in and they've already done some form of disclosure, like we talked about, you know, confessing your sins to one another, but they realize there's more to that story, and they're like, "Oh crap! Like that's going to cause more pain, and we're trying to build trust, but it's going to cause more pain now." And so that sensitivity of in your anxiety, don't force this upon people just yet. It's a very, very sensitive time that can ruin relationships if not dealt with sensitively. And so, definitely, I definitely want to second what Roy is saying is be very careful of prescribing that. If you are a pastor and counseling someone through what's going on at this an affair, it does take a lot of preparation work, and you want the wife or the husband, whoever is being betrayed, you want them to feel supported too and feel like they can process that stuff out. If not, they're gonna hold it inside, and they're going to explode inside, and that's going to make them do erratic things and maybe even cause more harm to the family. And so it's a very sensitive part of this process. And as like Roy's mentioned, sex addiction therapists, we are trained to take that as one step at a time and make sure that everyone's ready for something like this, because if not, it can create a lot more harm than good.
Now, how can I find a therapist that might fit well with what I need to do in terms of seeking them out? Do we just look up in the yellow pages, or how do we find, let's say, you or other people that in this field?
Right, sexhelp.com.
Sexhelp.com is ITAB is our organization that we've been trained under, but sexhelp.com is it's a directory of the therapists out there who are trained or in training to become a sex addiction therapist. That has the most comprehensive kind of listing for that, and so that would probably be the first step that I would recommend.
Andy and I, because we've gone through the training, we've gotten to know other sex addiction therapists personally, whether it's during the trainings themselves in other states or also during supervision when we have times to talk about our cases with people. And so we'd be happy to refer, if anyone wants to ask us for some referrals, because we know a lot of these therapists personally, especially according to where their office is located.
Right.
Because not everyone's going to be close to my office or your office. So
right.
We'd be happy to refer and recommend certain sex addiction therapists and also partner betrayal specialists too.
Thank you. This has been a very interesting topic. I hope to touch upon it sometime later again. Thank you for coming, Pastor Roy and Andy.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me too. Thank you.
Thank you. Today's topic, sex addiction, is a very serious one. If you feel that you need help, you can either talk to your pastor or you can ask for help to us. We will keep your information confidential. You can send us email kprt316@gmail.com. kprt316@gmail.com. We will try to get you in touch with the Pastor Roy or Andy, family therapist. God will be with you each and every step of your journey. K-Pastors Roundtable is a discussion program for today's English-speaking Koreans and Christians. We will discuss the current issues and important issues dealing with our community. Your participation is very important to us. You can send in your questions or comments via email kprt316@gmail.com. You can hear our program on AM 1190 in Southern California on Saturday and Sunday at 1:30 p.m. You can also find us on YouTube channel K Pastors Round Table. Please join us. Thank you.